everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're very happy to have you. I'm Kat, and I work for the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. We're very happy to be co-hosting tonight's event with College Republicans, Young Americans for Freedom, and Young Americans for Liberty. If you want to get to know more about the Clemson Institute, there's plenty of literature up at the front and outside for you to grab when you're done being here. Now let me introduce our speaker. Steve Simpson is the Director of Legal Studies at the Ayn Rand Institute. He writes, speaks, and gives interviews for ARI on constitutional law, freedom of speech, campaign finance law, and other legal topics. A former senior attorney at the Institute for Justice, Mr. Simpson has litigated constitutional cases in state and federal courts across the nation, as well as before the United States Supreme Court. He has testified in Congress and briefed congressional staffers on key constitutional issues. Mr. Simpson earned his law degree from New York Law School. He is a member of the bars of New York, New Jersey, and the District of Columbia. Now please join me in giving Mr. Simpson a very warm Clemson welcome.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kat, and thanks to the Clemson Institute for having me down to talk about the all-important issue of freedom of speech. The title of my talk tonight, Freedom of Speech Under Siege, I will get to in a moment, describing exactly why I think that is the case. But let me start by recognizing that free speech is a big topic these days. It's a topic of some controversy. Indeed, I understand that there's a certain amount of controversy going on here at Clemson over the topic, and that is certainly true across the United States at a number of, or I would say most, college campuses, and indeed in the culture in not only the United States, but in the Western world in general. And the primary reason for that, most recently, is the attacks in Paris in January, on the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris early in January. So I want to start off with that in kind of outlining the premises of my talk and what it is that I really want to talk about. So let me jump right into it then. So as everybody by now knows, early in January, the offices of a publication in Paris called Charlie Hebdo were attacked by Islamic terrorists. 12 people were murdered at the offices. And I put this up on the screen because this was the subject. This was the reason. This was the reason that, or among the reasons that Charlie Hebdo was attacked. They published cartoons like these, and they had done so over a number of years, that offended Muslims. And I think it's worth pausing for a moment and reflecting on the fact that in today's day and age, with the technology that we have, with the embrace or the supposed embrace of freedom of speech across the world, that there are people willing to kill for what other people say. And that's an important issue, and obviously it's led to a lot of controversy and a great deal of discussion on freedom of speech. It's unfortunately not the only time this has happened, so let me run through just to set the tone a bit and the context, some of the other attacks that have happened over the years. So back in the 1980s, the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie for publishing this book, The Satanic Verses. Again, because the idea or the attitude among many Muslims was that Rushdie had offended the Prophet Muhammad and Islam by publishing this book. Again, this is not the only time. Early in 2000, in Holland, a filmmaker by the name of Theo van Gogh was murdered for making a film critical of Islam. His co-filmmaker, a person who starred in the film, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is thankfully alive today, was threatened during that attack, and she's lived under the threat of death since that time. More recently, in 2006, the Danish publication Jyllands-Posten published a number of cartoons that depicted the Prophet Muhammad, and the cartoonists and the editor of that publication, a guy by the name of Fleming Rose, were threatened, and many of them there have been efforts to kill them for publishing these cartoons, among many others. Now, this isn't the Paris attacks aren't even the latest attacks of this kind. Most recently in Denmark, there was an attack on a cafe where the artist who drew this picture of Muhammad with a bomb in his turban, Kurt Westergaard, was giving a talk, and gunmen showed up and shot up the entire cafe. Now, the question I want to focus on is, why is this happening? What's going on here? Now, one answer would be to examine Islam and the terrorists and ask, why is it that they feel motivated to attack those who say things that offend them? And that's obviously a very important issue. It's not the issue I'm going to focus on tonight. Now, I would note that, that this is not unique to Islam. Throughout human history, many groups and individuals have attacked those who have spoken out against them in ways that have offended them. So certainly the urge to censor is not something that, that Islam as a religion or as a culture has a monopoly on. Indeed, Christians have attacked throughout history. Christians have called for the deaths of those who've blasphemed them, and of course totalitarian governments have censored speech and jailed and threatened and attacked those who have spoken out against them over time. So Islam certainly doesn't have any monopoly on the urge to censor. But what I want to focus on is a different part of the story. I want to focus on the attitude toward free speech, not only here in America, but I think in the Western world generally, because I think that we are developing an attitude, and we can see this attitude after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, that I think is very ominous and is dangerous to the continued vitality of freedom of speech. Now, I would characterize that view as the yes, but view, right? So you heard this after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. It's, yes, free speech is important, but you shouldn't offend people's religion. Or, yes, free speech is important, but you shouldn't criticize ideas that other people hold dear. Let me recount a few of the ways in which we've seen this since the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then I'll talk about what I think this means. So soon after the attacks, Pope Francis actually said essentially what I just said. Here's what he said. He said he stressed that the Paris attack was not justified, but, he added, that the reaction could have been expected. The reaction being the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. According to the Pope, Charlie Hebdo were provocateurs, and he said, quote, "You cannot insult the faith of others." Not too long after the Paris attacks, there was a journalism professor from a university in West Virginia who wrote an article for USA Today, and he said that Charlie Hebdo's mocking pictures of Muhammad were, quote, "beyond the limits of the endurable and outside the protections of the First Amendment." This is a journalism professor, okay? Now, this isn't the first time this kind of attitude that we've seen, this kind of attitude. Indeed, after the Danish cartoon controversy back in 2006, the Bush administration made clear that it had great sympathy for those who were offended and outraged by it. And remember, this was a controversy in which many Muslims worldwide were calling for the deaths of not only the cartoonists, but the editor of the publication, Fleming Rose, and there were actual attacks. I talked about the attacks on Kurt Westergaard earlier, and this is what the Bush administration found fit to say. Quote, "We find them offensive," that is the cartoons, "and we certainly understand why Muslims would find these images offensive." Now, I submit that if this is the attitude after people are being threatened and even killed for speaking out, that those who are saying this, what I've called the yes but attitude, care far more about not offending people than they do about freedom of speech. This is a very ominous development in my view, and I'm going to explain through the course of my talk why and what I think is wrong with it. Unfortunately, it's not limited to this subject of Islam. I think we're seeing it across the nation, not only on college campuses, and I'm going to talk a good deal about the attitude toward free speech on college campuses today, what I think typifies that attitude. But I think this is going on in the culture in general. And again, it is typified by this yes, but. One way you could characterize it is free speech is important, but it doesn't include the right to offend people. Now, my view is the exact opposite of that. Free speech absolutely includes the right to offend people. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the idea that free speech doesn't include the right to offend is the same thing as saying there is no such thing as free speech. And I'll explain why I say that. So my point here isn't we should go out and offend people just because we have the right to free speech. It's if we take freedom of speech seriously and the freedom of thought that underlies it, we absolutely have to be willing to offend people. That's the case I want to make today. So just to recap and to make clear what my overall point is, I think freedom of speech is under siege in the world today, not just in America and not just on college campuses. But the primary culprit for that is not terrorist attacks. Okay, that's bad, obviously. And it does amount to an attack on free speech. But it is an attack on free speech primarily if and because we are not prepared to stand up to it. Not just physically, i.e. sending the military or the police to protect people or to go after the bad guys, so to speak, but morally. We have to be willing to say, especially in the face of attacks like this, we absolutely have the right to offend you, and if you don't like it, the answer is to talk back, to debate, to disagree, or to walk away. But terror and force are absolutely verboten. They are absolutely off the table. Now that, I think, the attitude that allows that to creep in, the idea that we should feel some sympathy for people who attack others for speaking, that's a kind of appeasing attitude, and that, I think, is exactly what breeds the kind of terror we're seeing today. And if we don't stop it, we're going to see more of it. So that's the case I want to make. All right, I want to start off then by talking about what I think is going on college campuses. In fact, let me outline sort of the points I'm going to make. First, I'm going to spend some time talking about the attitude toward free speech, primarily on college campuses, but as I said, I think this is going on in the nation in general, and indeed the entire Western world, but I have to focus on something, so I'll stick with college campuses. So that's the first point. There's a culture or a view of free speech that holds that it doesn't include the right to offend. After that, I'm going to explain why I think free speech has to include the right to offend, and then I want to talk more about the political right to free speech, what it entails, and what we can expect from our government, not only in protecting our right to free speech, but in protecting our other rights as well. All right, so I want to start off, again, I started with an image that has inflamed many people, or several images that have inflamed many people the world over, and that's what I want to go to again. So I'm going to show you another terribly offensive image, and here it is. Yep. So that is a picture of Malcolm Reynolds. I don't know how many people here ever watched the TV show Firefly. Probably not many, because it was only on the air for a while. And if I'm going to be offended by anything, it's the fact that Fox canceled this show. But let me read you the quote. This is an actual poster. This poster was put on the door of a professor at the University of Wisconsin Stout. Here's what the quote says, and it looked just like that. Quote, "You don't know me, son, so let me explain to you once. If I ever kill you, you'll be awake, you'll be facing me, and you'll be armed." And if you knew the show, you'd think that was really cool. But leaving that aside, the point of this is that this poster was put on a teacher's door. Security showed up, took the poster down, and told them he could be brought up on criminal charges for creating a threatening environment. Now, I think that's ridiculous. This is obviously not a threat. But I think it typifies what I would call the culture of sensitivity that's not only growing on America's campuses these days, but in the nation in general. So I want to spend some time talking about that. Now, what do I mean by culture of sensitivity? Simply put, it's this. It captures the idea that offending people is, or preventing people from being offended is much more important than hearing what they have to say, thinking about what they have to say, and listening to their speech. So it's outrage over knowledge over the pursuit of knowledge. It's ultimately a kind of culture of emotion over reason, and it holds very often that offensive comments and offensive speech go as far as to threaten people and make them feel unsafe. So let me round that out with a few examples. So I want to start with an example from, this is a writer by the name of Wendy Kaminer, who wrote an article in the Washington Post not long ago about a panel discussion at Smith College that she was on. She's an academic and a writer, and she often goes to colleges and speaks about all sorts of issues. The topic for this panel was the academic echo chamber. So they were talking about how academics think and discuss ideas and talk. So the subject was very much what academics do. And as she recounts the story, she's on this panel, she thinks it goes well. Later on, she sees a transcript in the college newspaper. And here's what the transcript is preceded by. Quote, this was what she described as a trigger or content warning. Quote, racism/racial slurs, ableist slurs, anti-Semitic language, anti-Muslim Islamophobic language, anti-immigrant language, sexist misogynistic slurs, references to race-based violence, references to anti-Semitic violence. Okay, this actually came before the transcript. Before anybody read the transcript, this was the label emblazoned on it. And thinking about that, you might think that the entire panel discussion was one long racist and sexist rant, but not according to Kaminer. In fact, she gives certain examples of the types of things that prompted these, what have come to be known as trigger warnings or content warnings. So at one point, one of the panelists joked about the other panelists, hey, we're all just a bunch of wild and crazy scholars up here, having a good time. In the transcript, the word crazy was blotted out and replaced by ableist slur. Okay, she continues. At another point, one of the panelists remarked that the State Department has banned, or at one point had banned, the words jihad, Islamist, and caliphate. In the transcript, these words were flagged as anti-Muslim Islamophobic language. Now note that this guy was just noting a fact. The State Department had banned these terms. He wasn't endorsing the terms. He wasn't saying, I think these are good terms or bad terms. He was just stating them on this panel. And yet there was a trigger warning or a content warning, anti-Islamist language. Continuing on, Kaminer during the panel described an incident in which a colleague of hers was disciplined for using the term wetback, not as a pejorative, but again to describe to students in the midst of a discussion what this term meant. And he was explaining exactly why it was a pejorative term. Later on in the transcript for this discussion, that term was blocked out and replaced with the words anti-Latin, anti-immigrant slur. Now the coup de grace was Kaminer herself trying to convince her colleagues that the euphemism N-word, and I think everybody knows what that stands for, in academic discussions, she was trying to convince her colleagues we shouldn't use this when we're talking about a text that actually uses the word, right? Now you can agree with her or disagree with her. I tend to, well, I don't know what I think about it, but it doesn't ultimately matter because her point was to make an argument about how we teach or how academics teach and how the sort of language they use and how they should deal with pedagogical issues. Later on, she was surprised to hear herself branded as a racist on campus, and the Huffington Post went as far as to say that she had committed an explicit act of racial violence. Okay, it was racial violence for her to use the N-word in a discussion about how people teach and discuss this issue. Now, as she later remarked, can't these people tell the difference between actually issuing a slur or using a pejorative term versus discussing the term? And that's part of what I think typifies what I would call the culture of sensitivity. Let me give you a couple more examples, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think this means. At the University of Chicago a while back, a number of students petitioned the school to implement a ban on hate speech after a gay rights advocate used the term tranny, which is short for transsexual, not in a pejorative sense. He was arguing that transsexuals ought to adopt this term as a kind of term of empowerment. Yet students protested. They didn't consider the context in which he was using it, and they called for a ban on this word, among others, as hate speech. Recently, in an article in the New York Times, this is very recent, a writer by the name of Judith Shulevitz wrote an article in which she talks about the rise of, sorry, let me get that off, so-called safe spaces. And the example she gives is a debate on a college campus between a feminist and a libertarian over the idea of the rape culture on campus today. And when many students found out that the libertarian was going to take the position that the idea of a rape culture is utter nonsense, she was going to argue against this idea and attack it, basically. There was an uproar on campus, and the university created a safe space for students to go to while this debate was going on, so they could feel, protected and safe. One of the students later remarked that during the debate she, quote, felt bombarded by a lot of viewpoints that really go against my dearly and closely held beliefs, and as a result she took refuge in this safe space. Now, there are a number of other examples that I could give you, and you can go and you can consult the articles that I've read, and there are many books, and there's a lot of other evidence of this, what I'd call a culture of sensitivity. But let me pause here and give you a sense of what I think is going on here and what it stands for. So first, there's the idea that students should be protected from controversial ideas, from ideas that might make them feel bad, right? Words that might be upsetting are flagged. They're issued trigger warnings before content that would supposedly upset them is either taught or discussed, and we have to create safe spaces where they can resort to when they feel upset. The second is the notion that ideas and even words taken out of context of their meaning, that is, when they're not even used as pejoratives or hurled at people as an effort to make them feel bad or even intimidate them, but just the words used can somehow render people unsafe. That is, words can be equivalent to threats even when they're not actual threats. And I'll talk a little bit later about threats. There is such a thing as threats, obviously. But there's a big difference between discussing ideas and threatening somebody with physical harm. But part of what I view as the culture of sensitivity conflates these terms. Now consider one question that you rarely hear in connection with these kinds of debates and protests. Are they true? Right? Is this correct? Is the view that I'm offended by and attacking, is it right? Is it true? Is it a good view? Is it a bad view? What do I think about it? How do I evaluate it? Right? Let's analyze this and figure out what's going on, and then we can debate against those who are wrong. We can choose sides, and we can have a discussion. Consider for a moment how strange it would be. At least I hope you think this is strange. That if I were to say, I'm terribly offended that some scientists think that human beings are causing the world to warm, right? Or causing climate change or global warming. Wouldn't your immediate reaction be, well, who cares if you're offended? I mean, isn't the question, is it true or not true? Or what should we do about it? Or how we should evaluate this, right? Imagine if I said, I'm offended by the fact that black people are allowed to eat next to white people, or Jews and Christians are allowed to consort with one another. I'm terribly offended by that. Wouldn't your reaction be, I don't give a crap if you're offended by that, okay? It's a wrong point of view, and here, let me explain why it's wrong. And I'm not bothered by the fact that you're offended by that at all, because it's a bad perspective. It's wrong, it's untrue, it's stupid, and it's outrageous, right? We debate, we discuss, we analyze these things. My point about the culture of sensitivity is it seeks to short-circuit all of that, all right? If we hold that taking offense or giving offense is far worse than thinking and evaluating ideas, obviously we are not going to determine whether ideas or views are true or good or bad. If we conclude that speech amounts to a threat because it offends people, we're obviously not going to embrace the pursuit of knowledge and the effort to try to figure out who's right or wrong. So what I think is going on with what I refer to as the culture of sensitivity is that it's characterized by emotion over reason and the view, which is a very dangerous view, that efforts to persuade or the exchange of ideas amount to threats. Now, I think if you take these two ideas seriously, that what matters in debates or discussions is not who is right, but how people feel, or if you construe or conclude that ideas, even offensive ideas, very controversial ideas, are tantamount to threats, you will definitely seek to censor speech. Okay, and that's the case I want to make now. Let me turn to what I think is wrong with this idea. Why is it that we have to have the freedom, the right to offend people, and that we indeed ought to embrace the idea of giving offense at times if we really take freedom of speech and what it means seriously? So let me talk a little bit about what I think freedom of speech is. And I want to start with another slide. Okay. So after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, in Seattle, a teacher showed the images of the cartoons from the cover of Charlie Hebdo to his students, and there was a protest in Seattle. And I picked up on this because of the sign. The sign obviously says freedom of speech, not freedom to offend. And the reason I point to that is because, as I said yesterday, two things really. One, I think this is the exact opposite of the truth. If we take free speech seriously, we have to be willing to offend people. And this is an example of this kind of attitude being embraced, not just on America's campuses, but elsewhere. And I think this is really part of the whole debate that you hear today. Does freedom of speech include freedom to offend? Now, as I said earlier, my point in embracing what I would call the freedom to offend, or the right to offend, is not we should go out of our way to offend people, right? I'm going to have a conversation with you and make fun of your yellow or your orange jersey because I think that color stinks. I mean, that's stupid, right? There's no point in doing that or making fun of anything. Just going out of your way to offend people just for the sake of offending people is not what I'm talking about at all. Although I do think, and I'll talk about why this is, that has to be protected under the First Amendment. What I'm getting at is if we are really taking thinking seriously, what thinking is and what free speech is and the pursuit of knowledge, we can't hope but to offend people. So let me unpack that a bit. And first, actually, let me back up a little and give you some examples of when it actually makes very good sense to offend people. So what I'm defending here is not just an issue of thought, but an issue of the effectiveness of speech and why the freedom to offend is necessarily part of speech. All right, so let's go back to the Muhammad cartoons for a minute. So take a look at the one on the left side, the Kurt Westergaard. So obviously, Westergaard's view here is pretty clear. He thinks there's a connection between Islam and violence, all right? And I would call this a very effective way of depicting that. Now, you might disagree with him, and you might find it offensive, but that's a very effective way to convey your point, right? The slide on the other side, I don't know if you can tell, but it shows terrorists going up to heaven and presumably Muhammad saying, "Stop, stop, we ran out of virgins." Another point, right? He's making the point, you're killing too many people, right? Again, it could be a debatable point. I don't happen to think it's a debatable point, but you can debate it. But his meaning is clear, right? And these are two of the cartoons found wildly offensive, right? My point here is offensive speech can be very enlightening and very illuminating. Let me give you another example, just so you don't think that I'm dumping too much on Islam. So two more cartoons, both of these were published in the New York Times not long ago, I think in an article about offensive speech. The one on the left, obviously a Hasidic, evil-looking Jewish guy who's the puppet master of President Obama and John McCain. This was no doubt published during the election between, or the campaign between Obama and McCain. Now, again, I don't think this is true, but it conveys pretty clearly what the meaning of the author, the cartoonist is, right? There's a kind of, Jewish or Israeli conspiracy to control our government, right? Again, I think it's wrong, but it's very clear what he's getting at. The one on the other side, that's actually written or drawn by none other than Dr. Seuss. Probably everybody knows who Dr. Seuss is, I hope. This was done during World War II. And his point here is our open borders policy is going to lead to lots of Japanese people who are working with the Japanese government coming in and undermining our government. Very offensive, but he makes a point. Now, again, I don't agree with the point, but it's an effective way to make a point. And no doubt, it raises a lot of controversy, and controversy is a good way to get your message out. Again, one more, just to be equal opportunity. On the left is a playbill from the Book of Mormon. You've probably all heard about this. It's the Broadway show written and created by the producers of South Park. Very offensive to Mormons, or at least purposely critical of Mormons. Very much a satirical piece. On the right is an artwork called Piss Christ. That is a crucifix dunked in urine. Pretty clear what the artist thinks. At least he doesn't think very much of Christianity or the crucifix, right? Again, he's conveying his ideas in a very offensive, but one could say very effective way. All right, let me move from offensive to edifying. In order to convey my essential point, I want to start off with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. This kind of captures where I'm going with why offensive speech has to be protected and indeed embraced. So the quote is, "Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." In other words, now what I'm focusing on here, it's notable that Jefferson is willing to question God and push back against Christianity at a time when many people, if not most, in the Western world were Christians. But I want to focus on the latter part. It's reason as opposed to blindfolded fear. I think this is very, very trenchant observation. On the one hand, it's the pursuit of reason and knowledge. On the other hand, blindfolded fear. Okay? If we are not willing to pursue reason to where it leads, we end up with blindfolded fear. We end up closing our minds down, and that's the path to not only taking offense at everything, but inability to deal with the real world, and as he calls it, blindfolded fear. I think that's a wonderful way to characterize a mentality that prevailed prior to the Enlightenment, which was the Dark Ages. But that's kind of the theme of what I want to say. So let me make 3 points here. The first point is, and this is again why we have to embrace and allow people to engage in offensive speech. The first point is, and all of these I think are evident from what I've been saying, but freedom of speech and freedom of thought are connected. They're indelibly, inextricably intertwined. The reason to speak is that we want to communicate our ideas. We want to communicate and we want to get information. Right? What precedes that is thinking. And thinking is necessary to human survival, human flourishing, and everything that makes life good. Okay? So the reason that we speak is because first we want to think and we want to communicate ideas. That's true whether we are communicating mundane points, where's the best restaurant, or profound points, how do we cure this disease, let's talk about great art, whatever. Thinking and speaking are indelibly connected. But here's the thing about thought. It has to be free in order to work. Okay? For thinking to be effective and useful, you have to do it yourself. It can't be forced. Other people can't do your thinking for you. It can't be faked. Okay? Consider a moment trying to fake your way through college or fake your way through an exam. No doubt it happens sometimes, but people who fake their way through school are not actually learning what they're learning, right? Imagine faking your way through a math test. At the end of the test, you've managed to convince the teacher that you knew or seemed to know the information, but you didn't actually know it. Now go out and try to apply it and use it. Okay? Thought has to be self-initiated by you, and it can't be forced by other people. You can't make a person come to the correct conclusion if he's wrong, and you can't make a person abandon the wrong conclusion, right, if he's wrong. All you can do is force him to shut up. You can't make him think. Thinking is something that's individual and has to be done by you. Now, the reason that offensive speech, in my view, has to be protected and indeed embraced follows from both of these points, right? The reason we speak in order to communicate, in order to better our lives, it's part of thinking. And thinking can't be compelled, right? You have to follow. Another way to put this is, you have to follow reason where it leads. You have to, if you want to pursue truth and you actually want to understand the world, you've got to pursue the facts and you've got to pursue thinking to wherever it goes. And if it runs up against somebody else who disagrees, you can't just pretend that you agree with them. You can't just close off your mind and stop thinking at that point. You've got to continue to think if you really want to pursue reason or pursue knowledge and pursue truth. So, sorry. So let me take a few examples and illustrate what I'm talking about. Think about Galileo, right? Galileo challenged the church's view that the earth was the center of the universe, okay? He didn't get up one morning and say to himself, I want to go piss off the Pope, right? He got up one morning, presumably, and said, I want to figure out the way the universe works. So he engaged, used his mind, he used the scientific method, and he followed his reason where it took him. And where it took him was smack up against the church's view of the way things should be, right? And obviously it offended the church. But that wasn't his goal. At least it's not his primary goal. Another example, Darwin, okay? Darwin has angered a lot of people who don't like the idea that human beings have descended from lower species, from the apes, okay? Especially angered the church and Christians and other religions who believe that we were created through, we were created by a divine, God, right? Now again, Darwin, he engaged in a process of thought and study for many, many years before he published The Origin of the Species. His goal was not to anger Christians. It was to figure out where we come from. And he looked at the evidence, and he followed reason where it led. And it led him smack up against people who thought that, we all descend from Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. And he ultimately argued with them, and I believe proved them all wrong. But ultimately, you don't have to agree with me to see the point. The point is, if you are engaging in a process of thought, in a process of science, you are necessarily going to run up against people who disagree. And I'll talk about what the solution is. I can highlight it now by saying that the proper solution is to debate, and if you can't come to an agreement, to disagree and walk away. But let me give you a couple more examples. In the 19th century, publications carrying information about contraception were deemed obscene and prohibited to be sent from the U.S. mail. Why? They offended a lot of people, okay? Their reason was not, we have good evidence for why contraception shouldn't be used or allowed. It was, this bothers us, this offends us, we don't think women should be having sex, and we certainly don't think that women should be having sex for the purpose of pleasure, right? The purpose of having sex is having children, right? That was a view that many people held, and they were offended by the idea that women should be able to use contraception. One more example. Southern slave owners were very offended by the idea that slavery was an abomination, and they sought to censor abolitionist writings during the Civil War and era of the slaves. Again, people offended by other people making arguments about what they believe are right, not because they think that, not because they're mustering evidence and engaging in an effort to persuade, but just because they're angry that another person's views conflict with theirs. So my ultimate point is this: if we're actually going to follow reason where it leads, if we're going to pursue knowledge and truth, we have to be prepared to offend other people. Indeed, if we're not prepared to offend other people, we'll ultimately be bounded by the thin skin of others, by the emotions of others, and necessarily we essentially hand a veto to anybody who is willing to be offended by what we think, what knowledge we want to pursue, and where we want where we want to take our inquiries and our discussions. That's tantamount to saying that free speech really doesn't exist. Now, the reason is this. Think about who it is that ever wants to shut down somebody else's speech. It is always somebody who disagrees with that other person, right? You never seek to censor the people that you agree with. Okay? Freedom of speech is always a right and a value to those who are in the minority of opinion. It's always necessary, or it's always something that is invoked by those who are countering the mainstream view. It's always something used by the person who is out of agreement with everybody else. And it is often the case, indeed I would say in most cases where anybody wants to shut down somebody else's speech, it's almost always the case that those who want to do it are offended by what those in the minority think. So if we actually take seriously the idea that offense trumps speech, we are in effect accepting the idea that free speech doesn't exist at all. Accept the speech that nobody really cares about. Accept the inquiry that already agrees with what everybody else thinks. If Galileo had said, yeah, the earth is the center of the universe, the Catholic Church never would have objected. It only objected because he wanted to counter what they thought. So if offensive speech isn't part of the right to free speech, that's tantamount to saying we don't have the right to free speech at all. This is obviously a very dangerous notion. All right, let me talk a bit about what the right to free speech entails, and then I'll wrap it up. So I've just talked about what I would call the value of free speech, or the nature of free speech, right? And it's an intimate connection to freedom of thought. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the political right to free speech. And again, I want to start with a Jefferson quote. Let me skip that. Here's the quote. Quote, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say, there are 20 gods or no God. He neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error." Now, I think this captures the point of what the right to free speech, the political and legal right, is all about and why. And there are two basic points contained in what Jefferson is saying. One is that reason and thinking are important, but they have to be free to work. The idea of free inquiry as the only effectual agent against error. Number two, there's a really big difference between force and persuasion. Okay? It does me no injury for my neighbor to think there are 20 gods or no God. Persuasion and ideas, it's not the same thing as picking my pocket nor breaking my leg. But let me talk a little bit about these. As I said earlier, in order for thinking to be valuable to us, it has to be free and self-initiated. It has to go where it's going to go. Another way to put this is that trying to force somebody to be silent doesn't make that person agree with you, okay? You put a gun against Darwin's head. He doesn't agree with you that we all descended from Adam and Eve. All you can do is shut him up. All you can do is stop him from trying to do what he's doing, which is to pursue truth. Okay, he loses, but we lose too. Anybody who does that ends up losing the value that free speech has to offer. Okay, freedom of speech and freedom of thought are tremendous values in our lives. I would go as far as to say, well, I think this is true if you think about it. Everything we enjoy in the modern world today, all of the technological achievements are due to human thought. Okay? If we really value that, we have to value free thought. It's almost a redundancy. It can't work otherwise. All you can do by trying to shut down free thought and by extension free communication is stop people from thinking. It's not a value. It cannot advance what human beings should want to advance, to live in a free and civil society. Now, what that leads to, I think, and I can elaborate on this in the question period if you want, but let me cut to it, is that why we need government is to distinguish between those who want to engage in peaceful discussion, at least in this context, and those, as Jefferson puts it, who want to break your leg or pick your pocket. In other words, the purpose of government is to protect us. It's to protect our rights. It's to protect us from criminals. It is not to decide what we think in our minds. It's just to prevent us from using our bodies, so to speak, from using weapons, from using force to inhibit other people from functioning. The role of government is to prevent crime. It is not, as Jefferson put it, to to worry about what we think and what our views are. Now, rights, and not just the First Amendment right to free speech, but all rights are the foundation for proper system of government and a proper system of laws. What rights say essentially is you can act in a way that's peaceful and free so long as you respect the rights of other people. Now, in the context of free speech, I think that has two implications. First, it doesn't mean that you get to say anything you want in any context ever. Okay? The right to free speech is as much bounded by proper law and other people's rights as any other right is. Now, that's easy to see when, as my dad used to put it, your right to swing your arm around ends at the end of my nose, right? That's a physical action. Now, the issue of how we bound free speech, rights to free speech, and ensure that they don't trample other people's rights, is a complicated issue. But there are a few general principles that I think make this point clear. So take the idea of fraud, let's say, right? You have the right to talk to people, you have the right to share information. You don't have the right to trick them into giving you their property. That's effectively stealing, okay? Conspiracy. Conspiracy is a plan among a number of people to commit a crime, right? To rob a bank, let's say. And in both those examples, you use speech to facilitate the crime, but the ultimate purpose is to steal, okay? Another example of something you can't do in free speech is threats, all right? But there's a big difference between speaking in a way that offends somebody and speaking in a way that communicates that you're going to use force against them, right? I'm going to kill you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. That's different from saying, I don't like the shirt you're wearing, or I think your religion is wrong. Okay, those are two different things. Let me give you an example. So there's a big difference between this, which a lot of people take to be offensive. So Charlie Hebdo offended people by making fun of the Prophet Muhammad. And this. All right, this is a website published by Islamists calling for the deaths of those who have offended Islam. The guy with the bullet going through his head is a guy named, I think it's Terry Jones, who's the pastor in Florida who wanted to burn a pile of Qurans several years ago. But a number of other people, including Kurt Westergaard is on here, Salman Rushdie is on here, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Molly Norris is a cartoonist who started the Draw Muhammad Day, if anybody had heard about this, and there are a number of others. Fleming Rose is on here as well. This is an effort by Islamic terrorists to try to get other people, other Muslims, other Islamic terrorists, to go and kill these people. This is a threat. That's what a threat looks like, okay? We want to put a bullet in the heads of infidels. And this, I mean, there's more to this, but this is clearly, this was on a website, this is clearly a call to commit murder. That's a threat, okay? A clear communication of a desire or a plan to harm somebody, that's a threat. And we have to keep clear distinction between the two. If we don't, we end up punishing speech and excusing threats. So, the second point I wanted to make is that the right to free speech does not mean that you have the right to be free of other people's judgment or other people's actions, right? It doesn't mean that you have the right to be not to be held accountable for what you say. If you say stupid things, people are going to treat you as an idiot, right? If you say horrible things, people are going to stop associating with you. Okay, let me take just one quick example. A few weeks ago, we heard about this video at the University of Oklahoma, a number of frat guys on a bus chanting racist slogans. I have to say, I agree with the president of the University of Oklahoma when he said he wanted to kick those guys out of school. I think that's absolutely appropriate. Now, it's complicated by the fact that it's a state school, and I can talk about why it's complicated, but I think it makes perfectly good sense to say, look, if this is what you think, we don't want you in our university. You're an idiot, and you're also a horrible person, and we don't want you around. That's entirely appropriate. That's how you distinguish, and that's how you maintain harmonious relationships in a civilized society. When people disagree, they part company. And often that means, I don't want you around me. I don't want you to come to my house. I don't want you to be employed by me. I don't want you to go to my school because I think you're an idiot. But that's very different from telling somebody that they have to shut up and they're not allowed to speak anymore. That's what protecting the right to free speech means. It means respecting their right to speak. It does not mean always respecting what they say. So the principle is this: say what you want, so long as it doesn't violate the rights of others by committing crimes, say, but be prepared to be judged for it. That's the proper principle of free speech in a free society. That means allowing people to say things that are offensive, but being prepared to judge them for saying those things and to debate those things. Okay, I want to end with this quote. This is Voltaire. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Freedom of speech is the means by which we prevent people from believing absurdities in order to prevent them from committing atrocities. It is absolutely essential to a free society. And the idea that, offensive speech is not included is definitely wrong and contrary to the view or the idea of free thought and free speech. Thank you. All right, questions? There have to be questions after that. Anybody? Sure.
Could you address how you felt about you said at the beginning you talked about the questions on our specific campus. Could you address the free speech questions?
You know, I would be able to do it easier if somebody would explain precisely what the issue is. I mean, I'm aware of it, but remembering exactly what the controversy is a bit tough for me. So if you give me a hypothetical, I'll tell you what I think.
Okay. The two things that kind of happened in order. First, there was a party at a fraternity house where it was themed with a gang theme. And then following that, there was a call to change the name of a university building because the person who it was named after was a white supremacist.
So just those two things?
Those two things.
So I think those are the kinds of things that, I mean, I don't know that I would call them free speech issues, right? They're issues of disagreement, and there can be good reasons to change the name of a university building if it's named after a racist. I mean, I could see a good argument for doing that. I can't say I have strong views on that question one way or another. What I would say is I don't think that that is or should be a free speech controversy. And part of the reason I think it is a free speech controversy is because we have what I referred to as a culture of sensitivity. Now, the reason that what I refer to as that, exists in America today, I think, is based on, there are philosophical causes. There are ideas that lead people to believe that the worst thing you can do is offend somebody, and that offending them is tantamount to threatening, which I didn't get into, but that's a whole other discussion. I think a lot of these types of controversies are kind of outgrowths of that. But that's a much different talk than an issue than what the right to free speech and the value of free speech encompasses. Ultimately, I would say this. If people are free to walk away from one another, then those kinds of issues will be settled relatively easily. I said earlier when I was talking about the University of Oklahoma that the fact that it's a public university complicates things. Okay, and part of the reason that it's a public, the fact that it's a public university complicates things, or the whole reason, is that it's government run. Okay, and what does that mean? It means it is run by an entity that people can't really disassociate themselves from, because we are all, we all live in this society and we're governed by this one government. We have to pay for it. When taxpayers have to pay for a university or anything else, they have a right to be upset by what that university does. Okay? If we remove that taxpayer funding, we eliminate that problem. Now, that's a big deal, I get. I'm not saying, tomorrow let's remove the state from all universities. It's not that simple, obviously. But when you involve government in things, you create a necessary condition for conflict, right? Because people don't have the choice to disassociate themselves from the government or what government does, because it operates by law. And that complicates everything. So the rule should be, or if we want to promote a harmonious society, a civilized society, we should leave people absolutely free to walk away when they want. And I think a lot of these conflicts come up. So let's say conflicts about, think about the Nazi Skokie March in Illinois this was many decades ago. But it involved Nazis marching in a predominantly Jewish community. Okay? Now they were marching on the public streets, and part of the problem is that, and you could argue this one either way, I tend to agree with the Supreme Court, if you're going to have public streets and public spaces, people have to have a right to speak on them. But notice the conflict that creates. If you have, public parks and people are allowed to speak in them, you have to allow all comers, and that creates necessarily a condition for conflict. So we ought to minimize those as much as possible and get government out of what would otherwise be the private domain. That's the ultimate solution. It's not an easy solution, but I think it's the ultimate solution. Other questions? Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned that somebody should be allowed to say whatever they can as long as it's not a threat, but they have to be prepared for judgment of others. But if the judgment includes a punishment for what they said, that's not really free speech.
Well, I think it depends. So what is the nature of the punishment at issue?
Being expelled, for instance.
Yeah, so I don't agree with that. Free speech, now, I've used the term free speech in two different senses tonight. I've used it in the sense of allowing your mind to be free of, let's say, commandments externally to tell you what to think, right? Versus freedom from government intervention, all right? What freedom of speech is created to do, ultimately, as a right, is to tell the government this far and no further. This is what you're allowed to do, and you are not allowed to invade in this area. I think it's much more than just what we think and what we say. We should have freedom to take action on the basis of our thoughts and to guide our own lives according to our own judgment, so long as we don't violate the rights of others. It's not a violation of somebody else's right to say, I don't want, or you're right, if you want to come into my house and start, talking to me about anything. So obviously I'm from the Ayn Rand Institute, okay? Big fan of Atlas Shrugged. But I don't want you to come into my living room and start reading the Galt speech to me, okay? You're not allowed to do that. I might want to listen to you do it somewhere else, but me telling you, get the hell out of my living room, you can't do this on my property, that's not a violation of your right to free speech. You have every right to go speak and communicate what you want elsewhere, right? So part of the point, I didn't get into this, but there's a necessary connection between the right to free speech, the right to property, the right to association, the right to contract. In my view, all of these are part of an indivisible whole, which I would ultimately say you have the right to control your own actions, you have the right to keep the fruits of your own labors, you have the right to use property however you want, so long as it doesn't violate the rights of others, which means initiates force against them. And if we actually protect those rights, we'll have a much more harmonious society. But I don't think, you don't have a right to go to a university. It can't be true, right? Because you apply and they can read your application and say, I don't want this guy to come here. And imagine if, I mean, this is crazy, obviously, but imagine if I think it's the SAE frat at University of Oklahoma, if they applied to the university and they said, and by the way, here's a cool video that we did with them, you know, doing the racist chants on the bus. Do you think the University of Oklahoma would have accepted them? I wouldn't have. Do you think it's a violation of their rights not to accept them? Of course not. It can't be. It makes no sense. Right? People have, part of the right to free speech is the right to judge other people. That's the whole goal of it. The goal is thinking and judging our surroundings and guiding our own lives. So I think as long as you protect all of people's rights, you don't end up with these clashes between some people's right to free speech, let's say, and another person's right to property. Sure.
Do you think anything should be done in cases of bullying or harassment?
Short answer, yes, definitely. But it depends on how you define it. I have 3 girls, and they're in school now, and so the bullying phenomenon is a big deal. I think it is a really sensible thing for schools and adults to be concerned about, but you have to make a sharp distinction, again, in a sense, between intimidating, threatening behavior and just boorish, stupid, annoying, or offensive behavior. So from a legal standpoint, now it's a separate question what parents do and how schools are administered. And I do think there's a good argument for being really sensitive to this, because bullying can disrupt the ability to teach, and there are all kinds of problems with that. And that would go well beyond bullying to name calling, all kinds of things. But that's an issue for teachers and administrators to work out, and not being one, I might have different views, but they should be free to do it. But definitely it's certainly possible to violate somebody's rights through intimidation, okay? So you call them every day and you just, there's just dead silence. Or it's once an hour they get a phone call and it's dead silence. And after a while this recurs, it continues. And what is the natural reaction for anybody? Somebody is harassing me. I now actually am starting to feel threatened, okay? It's different from calling somebody a name. If it's repeated behavior in a way that intrudes into their lives, and importantly for criminal purposes, the state would have to show intent. They'd have to show that that's what the person actually intends to be doing. It can't just be a mistake. My phone, or the phone wires are crossed, and every time I try to call my mom, I get you on the phone. That's not intimidation or threats. It's a problem that needs to be solved. So for there to be harassment, intimidation, or threats, you'd have to show that the person doing it is actually trying to intimidate the person. There are all kinds of ways the criminal law deals with that. But that's a real phenomenon, and it is a kind of a physical intrusion into your life that prevents you from, the quiet enjoyment of your life. Same thing if I park a truck right out on the street with a gigantic, speaker, and I blare, music or anything else at you. Readings of the Declaration of Independence turned up to 11, and I can't sleep anymore. That's an intrusion into my life. I love the Declaration of Independence, but I don't want it going on, aimed at my house at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I should be able to call the police and say, these guys are intruding into my life or preventing the quiet enjoyment of my property and my life, and that has to be prevented. But you need laws to define those distinctions. And I think the ultimate distinction is it's a physical intrusion in your life. It's something you can't avoid anymore. You're unable to get away from it. So think back to the Charlie Hebdo covers versus the wanted poster that I put up. Okay, you can walk away from Charlie Hebdo, right? You can not buy the magazine or the publication. You can just ignore them, and it's gone. They're gone from your lives now. They have no ability to affect you if you ignore them. You can't ignore the guys who are putting your picture on a website that says, go kill this person. You are no longer able to ignore that. And I mean, we can see that. That's not a debatable idea. Salman Rushdie has been on the run, living with bodyguards his entire life since the late 1980s. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, same thing. Kurt Westergaard, repeated efforts to kill him. Okay, Fleming Rose, same thing. The publisher of Jyllands Posten in the Danish publication. These guys are not free to just ignore the terrorists anymore. That's the difference between a threat or intimidation or harassment and speech. Others? Sure.
So I guess you have to include the issue incite, so you call for death or something. So that's a direct threat to them and they can't control.
Yes.
But what if, for instance, I call for the return of slavery or something? Do you think that qualifies as some speech that should be, because it is like I'm calling for something that directly violates someone's rights? What do you think?
If it's a general like argument about why slavery is a good thing, then no. If it's so calling for, so instead, let's put it this way. Now that's stupid and bad and horrible, right? I mean, you're an idiot if you really think we should call it. But you're entitled to be an idiot, right? You're entitled to make stupid arguments, if we take free speech seriously. I think there is a big difference from saying essentially it really. So the answer is it depends on what you say and what you're really calling for. So let's say instead of the wanted poster calling for the deaths of people, it was we need to round up people and enslave them. Right? If it was a real serious effort to do that, yes, that would be a violation of their rights in my view, because it requires physical capturing. It's tantamount to saying we're going to go kidnap these people, right, and then ship them off to some other country and enslave them. That has to be a crime. But again, it all comes down to what are you communicating? How specific is it? Directed at specific people, right, or a group of specific people, and how serious about it are you? Now, there's always a question with threats. It's possible to threaten somebody unintentionally, right? A classic example, or to not really be threatening them, but you're actually communicating. If you go into a bank with a toy gun that looks real and you say, give me the money, that's a threat, that's a crime. It doesn't matter that you couldn't have killed the teller, it's still a crime, right? If I accidentally communicate something that is objectively seen as a threat to the person that's being communicated to. It may not be a crime because I didn't intend to do it, but I could certainly cause them damages and be responsible for paying for that. But it all depends ultimately on what is the nature of the communication. What is it really calling for? You really have to think about that and look at it, right? So there's a case before the Supreme Court this term involving threats. I think it is threats. I'll call it threats by an ex-husband against his wife over Facebook. Now, this guy was clever. He couched them all in rap lyrics. And it was very kind of, you could, if you took it out of context, you could read this as, he's just a jerk, and he's just saying a lot of things about it. It was his own rap lyrics, but he always, in the rap lyrics, was talking about, in these songs he wrote and then posted on Facebook and then sent to his wife, right? It was always talking about really horrible things, coming to your house, slitting your throat, for doing all kinds of things that just happened to be exactly the things that his wife did and angered him, right? Now, if you look at the full context, in my view, this guy was clearly delivering a threat to this person, and she, the wife, felt intimidated. The police arrested him, and now it's a case before the Supreme Court. We'll see what the Supreme Court says. But, I mean, my point ultimately is this. There are hard questions, right, in the law, and you send them to juries, and you either hope the jury will convict or not. But the principle ultimately gets down to what is actually being communicated, what is the specificity of it, are you really communicating something that a reasonable person would take as a threat, and then do you intend to be doing it? If you intend to be doing it, it's a crime.
Okay, my question is basically about what political ideas should be.
I don't think there are any stated that way. There are no political ideas, right, as ideas that are unacceptable and beyond the pale in my view. As long as, so there's a difference between saying, I think America should be a communist country, and let's get together a communist conspiracy to help the Soviet Union overthrow America, which arguably, I'm not an expert on the American Communist Party, but arguably it was the latter and not the former. I could be wrong about that. I'm not making a statement about what the Communist Party in the US was actually doing. And that would be something that, say, the FBI or the police would have to piece that together. But there's a difference between saying, I think communism is great, and I hope one day in the future communism is adopted, and we're gonna actually overthrow the American government. Another way to think about this is the specific political ideas that motivate the desire to overthrow the government or to incite violence are really irrelevant. It's the incitement to violence that is the key. Sure.
Back in the 50s, President Eisenhower had a program to round up the Mexicans and put them on buses and bus them down south of the border, which I don't know how many thousands they did it. It was called Operation Wetback. But at that time, the laws of the country banned obscenity, nudity, swearing, all kinds of things, expectoration, and prayers were in schools, compulsory, and so forth and so on. In the subsequent generations, all of those censorship laws have been struck down by the courts, so that you can't be charged with hardly anything imaginable. But at the same time, anybody, a professor of American history who wanted to discuss Operation Wetback would have to watch it, right? In other words, the culture of sensitivity emerges after censorship has been more or less abolished. So there's sort of it was an insensitive society when it had censorship laws, you had to behave properly. It becomes a sensitive society when it's more or less anything goes. You see the kind of thing. So then it seems like if you wanted to have a more thick-skinned society, where, as a very, very famous professor of American government that I had, who died recently, used to say in class, he was talking about ethnic politics. He'd talk about big swaps and people of the Jewish persuasion. Yeah? With a little smile on his face, right? So that maybe if you want a more thick-skinned society, where people would be able to discuss in a very hard-hitting way, maybe we should bring back censorship laws that they had in Eisenhower's time.
I don't know that there's a causal connection between censorship laws going away and the rise of the culture of sensitivity. It's an interesting question. I would say, in a sense, they're manifestations of changing ideas, but I don't think there's a causal relationship between those two things. But that's a fascinating question, and I can't, what I would say is this. I mean, I think I could put it this way. I think what underlies what I call the culture of sensitivity is really two philosophical ideas, although exactly where they come from, which schools of thought, is a separate question. One is egalitarianism. One is the idea that we ought not judge people, and we ought, or to put it in the positive sense, everybody is equal, regardless of what they do or what they think, what they earn, how good they are, right? We can't make distinctions among people pretty much at all. And I think that's sort of the version, what's going on the extremes in this area, what I've called the culture of sensitivity, I think is an extreme version of egalitarianism. It's judgment is wrong. Judgment hurts people's feelings. It subjugates some people and gives a kind of unfair advantage to others. Now, there's a lot more to be said about that as a philosophical movement, where it comes from. I mean, in modern times, I think it's John Rawls, but you can trace it back to other people, Rousseau. And then another strain is there's no such thing as truth, right? There are no true ideas. There are no good ideas. All ideas are equally false, equally not, there's no real connection between ideas and reality. If you believe that, then everything becomes, then you can't make a distinction between good ideas, bad ideas, false ideas, true ideas, and you'll end up, I think, ultimately relying on something. You have to rely on something to make judgments as human beings. There's no escaping judgment, discrimination, and thinking. So what do you rely on if you can't rely on the idea that we can actually convince each other of what the truth is? You end up relying on emotion. You end up relying on your allegiance to other people and groups. You have to replace it with something. So I think, I think those are the ideas underlying the culture of sensitivity, but I'm not really sure if there's any connection to what you're talking about with the idea of the demise of those types of censorship laws. Other questions?
How is it that, like, a lot of places are able to get away with banning the American to Muslims or legal immigrants and stuff, because I feel like that's just a massive violation of the First Amendment.
A ban on the American flag is definitely, I mean, if it's an outright ban on your personal display of the American flag, no question about it. I would say, so the places that I've heard of this, was at UC Irvine, I think, that wanted to do this. Now, UC Irvine is a state school. If it were a private school, I would say they're allowed to ban the American flag on private school, on the private campus if they want. I think they're idiots for doing it, and I wouldn't send my kid there because that demonstrates an idiotic, atmosphere. I think it's wrong to do that. It's especially wrong on the grounds that somehow the American flag is somehow oppressive. I just don't buy that at all. But that's a separate debate about why some people think that Western culture is oppressive and is destructive to people, which I actually think is the exact opposite, is a complicated philosophical question. But the issue of whether or not, so I mean it's true that, so actually to get to your question, why are people able to get away with it? It's because they've accepted bad ideas ultimately. Now there's a lot to say about what those ideas are. And certainly it's true that a ban on the American flag, or frankly any other flag, would be a violation of people's free speech. If it's the communist flag, if you want to put a communist flag on your house, and we're not literally at war with the communists so that there would be some confusion as to whether you're a foreign agent, but leaving that aside, yeah, you can do it if you want. So a ban on that would definitely be a violation of free speech. And contrary to governing First Amendment law, by the way, there have been cases on that.
I know there's a lot of places that also try to ban, the Confederate flag or don't tread on me or things.
Yeah. Yeah, there shouldn't be bans on any of those things. But, so with the Confederate flag, I tend to think that that's a racist symbol. Now, I could be wrong about that. And when I was younger, I thought the flap over the Confederate flag was kind of stupid. Today, I've come around to the view that, no, I can actually see why people are offended by the Confederate flag. But, and look, so I don't know what anybody here thinks. Maybe you could convince me that I'm wrong about that. I'm not really taking a firm position. It's not like I've studied this in depth. But I get the argument. It's a symbol of the Old South, and the Old South didn't condone, but supported slavery and went to war to try to prop up slavery, right? So I see why people would be pissed off about the Confederate flag. I get that, right? But that doesn't mean that you should be able to ban it. What's the right response? Walk away. Don't deal with those people anymore. Don't go to a college that wants to fly the Confederate flag everywhere. Shun them. So this kind of gets back to your point earlier. One of the, what we ought to do is morally censure people, not legally censure them for saying things. We ought to judge them, and sometimes judge them harshly. You're an idiot, and I think that this is a horrible idea. Or you're making a mistake. You don't get why this is legitimately offensive to some people. And if you want to deal with those people, you shouldn't do that anymore. That's the right approach. But I think it's oftentimes when you get into specific debates about things that are offensive, it's really worth thinking hard about this from the perspective of the person who's offended, and ask yourself, why are they offended? Do they have any legitimate gripe at all? It doesn't mean they should be able to clamp down and ban the speech, but it's worth thinking that through. It gets really complicated, and there are oftentimes these types of debates are loaded with all sorts of sort of political implications, and part of the reason they are is that politics matters too much to us. Government does too much. I mean, this is a separate debate. But when government does as much as it does, owning property, passing laws that govern whom we can deal with, whom we can hire and fire, it forces us to take every issue that could be resolved privately simply by walking away and turn it into a political debate. And it's a very dangerous thing, but that's a sort of separate issue from the free speech point. Sure.
There's a movement by some to enact more campaign finance laws. Is this a free speech problem in your view?
Yes. I spent the better part of my career challenging campaign finance laws, so I definitely think that they're a violation of free speech. Really simple summary is this. The purpose of campaign finance laws is to regulate the amount of money spent in campaigns, right? in order to speak to any sized audience, but certainly a large audience, you have to spend a lot of money. There's no way around that. And if you're not going to spend money, you have to spend in-kind things. You'd have to, if people weren't giving you money to finance your campaign, they'd have to give you buses and signs and radio time and TV time. And the campaign finance laws, quite wisely, given their premises, restrict those donations just like they restrict cash donations, right? So if you restrict the money that goes to fund a campaign, you necessarily restrict how, vigorous a person can campaign and the amount of things they can say. There's no way around that. In fact, an easy way to see that this is absolutely true, and I think unarguable, is the campaign finance laws exempt the media. Okay, ask yourself, why would the campaign finance laws exempt the media if there weren't a connection between money and speech? The laws just regulate money. They don't tell the New York Times you're not allowed to print. But guess what happened? When they were writing the laws, the media said, wait a second, we spend a whole lot of money influencing campaigns, right? By printing the New York Times and, let's say, endorsing a particular candidate for office. So logically, wouldn't these laws apply to us? And everybody said, yes, of course. So they said, well, let's exempt them from it and only apply those restrictions to everybody else. Now, there's much more to say about it. I just wanted to sort of summarize the issue. But yeah, I think that they're definitely a restriction on speech. And we're seeing today, I think they're a purposeful restriction on speech. When they were first passed, they were less purposeful, meaning there was less of a intent to actually go after what people say in campaigns. Today, I think we actually are seeing a move toward clamping down on the speech that people don't like, which is entirely a logical development and entirely foreseeable. So yeah, I think they're an abomination from a free speech standpoint. Sure, one more. Anybody? Come on, it's the last one. Somebody has to ask the last question, otherwise it's not the last question anymore. Anybody okay?
Who decides the difference between something that's offensive and something that's threatening? And the idea of a Confederate flag, or I thought, what if you had a swastika? Would that be free speech, or would that be a threat to Jews?
I think it depends on how it's done. So who decides? So the who question, I mean, it's really twofold. It's the legislature when they write the laws that define what a threat is. And then it's the courts when they decide, was this actually a threat or was it something less? And then to subdivide it further, it's juries. Ultimately, juries make these decisions, right? Or it's courts in constitutional cases like the Supreme Court saying, the statute was written too broadly. It encompasses or doesn't get the line between speech and a threat correct. But I think more fundamentally, we have to decide this using sensible, rational, and objective means and principles. There are close calls, but I think we can get the principle right. So most of the debates are about principle, in my view. They're not about the close call cases, right? Most of them are about, look, does it offend us that somebody has a flag with a swastika on it? And because I've really, really offended, I'm going to interpret that to be a threat. But it's not really a threat. Now, it's horrible, right? But it depends on how it's done. If somebody goes on your property, like a Jewish family's property, and draws swastikas all over their house, or another example, an easier example perhaps, because it happens, well, it's happened at least in legal history more often, burning a cross on somebody's lawn. I think that's definitely a threat. I mean, I don't think there's any way, because that's what the Klan did. Before they came and lynched you, they burned a cross on your lawn. I mean, that's as clear a threat as you can possibly get. So there are a lot of ways to communicate a threat. And certainly, so this is one area in which I think issues like race, religion play into the law, in the sense that we have to consider the whole context when we're thinking about what is a threat versus what's not a threat. Things that were classically used by, let's say, white supremacists to threaten black people ought to be seriously considered as threats, unless there's some reason to think that it was a joke or you misunderstood what it was. Same thing with any other class of people that has historically been threatened by a government or another class of people. You do have to take that seriously. But I think you can distinguish between a threat and certainly you can distinguish between a threat and speech in principle, although there are going to be hard cases. But a threat is a communication of physical danger, right? It's a communication of physical harm. The question then becomes, what counts as that? And that can be a hard question. But I think most of the debates today are not about the specific fact issues. I think they're really about principle. And this is, part of the whole culture of sensitivity is to expand and make fuzzier the idea of a threat so that it covers things that I just don't like to hear. It really bothers me. All right, thank you.